Hi, welcome to another episode of Tell Me How You're Mighty, real talk about cheating. It's Tracy and Sarah here. Our guest today is Tina Swithin. And Tina spent 10 years in a high conflict custody battle with her ex, exploits that led her to start the One Mom's Battle blog about divorcing a narcissist. Representing herself, she ultimately persevered and won custody, but she found that many people resonated with her story and had similar horror stories in court. Tina works to raise awareness of post-separation abuse and narcissistic abuse in the family court system. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. And I'm sorry for the experience that led you to this place, but you do such good work for people who are going through this meat grinder. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you a bit about you've been blogging since 2011, so a long time. And people get criticized, and I've gotten this criticism about talking about narcissists, that the term gets overused. And I call them fuckwits to get around the problem. But but I wanted to know how you came to define it and how you see the term when you're talking about high conflict individuals. I mean, how did that come up to one mom's battle?
Sure. So it actually preceded my blog and my advocacy. I found myself sitting in a therapist's office after 7 years of a very difficult, and now I understand, abusive
Yeah.
marriage. Um, Trying to make sense of it. And for so long, I had begged my husband at the time to go to therapy with me, and he wouldn't come. He said that the issues were mine. And so I believed him because he had become, I call it my worthiness barometer over the years. And so I found a therapist and I sat on her couch for about an hour and a half, emotionally vomiting in her office and trying to make sense of my marriage and my life. And she she paused and walked across the room, brought back the DSM-5 and said, "Could you please read this excerpt?" And it was about narcissistic personality disorder. And she said, "I cannot diagnose him. I've never met him, and I'm not qualified to do that. But what you are telling me really lines up with this."
Mm.
And when I read it, I actually, back then, no one was talking about these things. It was 2008. And I remember feeling so relieved. And that is where, the optimist in me, when I had a descriptor for what was happening, I felt hope because I thought if it sounded exactly like him, it sounded like his dad, his brothers. And so I thought, wow, if we have a working term, we can fix this
Sure.
because I'm a fixer and I can fix anything. And so I went home that day and I had him read it. I was so excited to show him this is what the problem is.
And how'd that go over? I'm sure not well.
Actually, I we looked at a couple things online. Back then. There was nothing out there on the topic. Now it's inundated, but
Yeah.
back then, I felt even more hope because he said, when I read this, it sounds like my dad, but it doesn't sound like me. And I thought, well, if he sees his dad in this, we're one step closer to fixing this.
Wow.
Um, and so then we started in, this is, a lot of people will relate. He was willing to go to marriage therapy at that point, but he wanted a man
Mhm.
and he needed to be a PhD. So I found that, and it was 6 months into that process when the psychologist said, "I would really like for you to take a psych eval. I think there's something deeper going on than what I can help with here in my office."
Wow.
So that really started my journey.
Well, it must have been
Isn't
very
it interesting?
validating.
Because you were supposed to be the problem. I love the fact that you go along to therapy, you're the problem, and then during that therapy, he is identified as the problem. And I'm intrigued to know what you actually said, in that conversation where the therapist said, "Look, this is a narcissist."
Yeah.
What kind of things were you describing that provoked that reaction?
I we had he had a huge financial spending addiction, and so much of it was done behind my back. I still don't know where the money went, but by the time I found out that we were in debt, it was $1.6 million.
What? Oh my
Yeah.
God.
He had taken loans out against our house, um, our business, and we lost everything as a result. Our home, our businesses, our cars were being repossessed out of the driveway.
Oh my
And so, we had hit this head in our marriage to where I didn't know who I was married to, but I still believed I owned a lot of the problems. And, when the therapist said that to me, that, this is somebody who, oh, I should also mention, I shared a story with her about when I gave birth to my daughter. I had had a C-section, and his triathlons were so important to him that I left the hospital after a C-section with a newborn baby, and he drove us an hour to the lake. And I sat in the car with the baby right out of the hospital so he could go practice swim and running and bicycling.
God.
And then a week later, he made me go camping with him for a triathlon. Um,
Wow.
and she looked at me with horror. She could not believe. And I had received so much praise for being such a trooper that I saw it as a positive back then.
Do you look back in horror? I mean, just anyone listening to that would think, you put up with so much, and yet you're still going off to therapy saying you're the problem. And you're
Yes.
behaving like this. You're doing everything to make sure that he's happy. As you say, your happiness was defined by his happiness. Clearly, he didn't feel the same about you, or else he wouldn't have made you do that with a newborn baby. But do you now look back and think, "Oh, why did I do that?"
Oh, I look back and I want to hug that version of myself. And I have in therapy, to go back in time, and I didn't have the tools or the resources. And he had created such an uneven playing field because according to him, his family was perfect. And I came from this broken family. I felt almost honored that he would accept me and that his family would accept me because of my upbringing. And so it was already this very hierarchy of where I fell in the family and in our relationship that became my truth.
Yeah, he must have gotten, uh, as long as you were being a good chump and you understood the hierarchy, it's fine for him. But it
Yes.
sounds like through therapy you got validation, and clearly you eventually left him. And the rage that he must have felt, and I understand this because I had two fuckwits, but suddenly you're not good supply anymore, and it's must be terrifying to them at an existential level that someone could possibly rebel and get outside their control. Can you talk a bit about, I mean, you had 10 years of this, but could you kind of sum up what pushed you over the edge to get divorced? How did that happen?
It was through the 6 months of the marriage therapy together where this psychologist was really, really skilled at calling him out. And it got to the point where the psychologist would say, I will not meet with you alone, sir. I don't trust what you tell me, and that's unethical, and it's a waste of our time together. So I was able to see things through a different lens, and it was a huge wake up call. And I went home one day and I said, it's over. I'm not living this. I call it my fake fancy life. I'm packing the kids up. I'm moving to a reasonable sized house that we can actually afford. And, no more gated community, no more fancy life. And I'm going back to reality. And you're welcome to join me or not. And I moved out with the kids. And that lasted for about 8 months. We actually had somewhat of a nesting agreement because I didn't understand what it's like to leave one of these
Oh
individuals.
no. Yeah.
I, when he finally realized we had gone past the point of no return and he couldn't manipulate me back in, and I was establishing boundaries, I became a huge threat to him. And as a result, I ended up in a women's shelter with my
Oh.
kids, afraid for my life. And that was really the end. And then divorce proceedings started at that point.
And as a psychologist was alarmed enough by him to be in the same room as him, but you were linked forever by your children. And at that point, that, that must have for you been quite frightening to hear a professional's analysis of him and know this was somebody that you couldn't just request that someone else was with you when you had meetings with them. This is someone that's going to be in your life because of the children.
Absolutely. And even more chilling, the psychologist, his background was actually working in prisons
Mm.
with the worst of the worst offenders. And so for him to be alarmed by the behavior was chilling. Absolutely.
And thank God you took it in, because I'm not judging because I was married to a scary freak too, my cheater. And I know when it happened to me, it was like, I hear you intellectually, that makes sense, that makes sense. And I couldn't believe that, here I think I'm a smart woman, that I find myself in a domestic abuse situation. um, you kind of have this to survive it. I think you have this magical reality that like you can kind of manage it, that, you'll like you nested with this guy who's
Yes.
dangerous. So you're kind of thinking at one level, I can manage this. He'll understand. We'll figure it out. When you're dealing with like a raging rhinoceros, it's not a fair fight.
Right. But when I did first hear the term from the therapist originally, and when I said to her, "Great, what do we do? How do I fix this?" She looked at me and said, "You don't. You either accept that this is your life or you put on your shoes and you run like hell." And I was actually really annoyed.
Hmm.
I left her office upset, thinking, how dare you tell me I can't fix my marriage? And so, it was almost a welcome relief when he wanted to find a psychologist to help us, because I thought, she knows nothing about what I'm capable of. I can fix this. I kept going back to that. And I didn't want to rip my family apart because my daughters were 2 and 4 at the
Mm.
time. They were so little. And he had, really enforced the message for so long that I would fail without him. And I had some pretty significant health conditions that he had used. Now I understand as ammunition that no one would want me. I would fail. I would not be able to make it on my own. And so I had this cloud of fear, or that this had to work, because what would I do if our marriage fell apart?
Mm.
And it sounds as well as if it's an onlooker looking in would have thought this is the perfect family, the perfect relationship. I know
Yes.
that there was a lot of debt, but you had the possessions, you look well off, two beautiful children, and all looking good from the outside. So, which he must have loved as a
Yes.
narcissist. And then you ruined that for him. So he must have been absolutely filled with fury that that's the end of his impression management.
Yes. And in fact, we were very active and known in our community, to the point that I remember there had been a newspaper article done that labeled us as the golden couple
Oh,
of,
wow.
of our county. So it was image management for him, keeping me in line, and his family was very well known. And so it was a huge threat to him.
Wow. I wanted to talk to you a bit about what post-separation abuse. So you're nesting with him, but at some point this situation ends. And then that, it sounds like when that beautiful facade that he had created and you had kind of helped him create crumbles, that's when he ramps up the abuse. And I love that, I don't love it, but it has a name. I mean, and I think that's important because I certainly experienced this in both my divorces with controlling men, stalking and violating orders and very scary things. I needed a protection from abuse order. Um, and I just, at the time when I was going through, I felt like freak of the week. But it sounds like you've compared stories and I've compared stories and run a blog. That it's no, this is actually something that many women experience. Could you talk a bit about post-separation abuse and your experience and what it looks like?
Yeah, I actually created a wheel to try to make sense of what I was experiencing, and then to find out that, this is the playbook of the abuser. Is and if you wanted to find it, it's postseparationabuse.com, but it's very much neglectful and abusive parenting. These people never wanted the children to begin with. The children are disposable. They're for image, they're for family photos, on social media.
Yeah.
But when they're actually in charge of the children or on their parenting time, they're neglectful, they're abusive, because these kids are like pawns or weapons to them. That's the extent of it. It's isolation. It's trying to spread lies or rumors about you within the community so that you're cut off from any potential support.
Mhm.
It's harassment, it's stalking, and most of the time it's so under the radar that it doesn't cross over and count, in terms of a restraining order or protection orders from the court. They're very skilled and very stealth at, going right up to the line,
Yeah.
but not going over to where you can actually hold them accountable. It's legal abuse. It's utilizing the court system as their new platform of abuse. And I know I can say, and so many others can say, it's actually worse post separation than
Yeah.
what I experienced during the relationship. Um, it's also financial abuse. It's counter parenting. You've got the courts who expect you to co-parent, and you mentally have to almost parallel parent to survive this. But then you've got the other person who is, counter parenting, and whether it's a doctor's visit or whatever it is, they are creating chaos at every turn.
Yeah.
And so, it's a whole wheel of things that I've used to describe what we're going through. But at the end of the day, it's about maintaining power and control. And I think that is a very mixed message we send to survivors of abuse, that when you leave, you're being brave and you're doing the right thing. But we're not telling them that what waits on the other side of that,
Or abuse.
this whole new level of abuse. And it's painful because many of us have this concept or belief during the relationship that we're better able to protect our kids. I have mixed feelings about that.
Mhm.
But post separation abuse, your kids are in their care. And for many of us, that wasn't the reality of our relationship. He couldn't be bothered by the kids. And now, you've got a whole range from the Disneyland dad to the absolute monster abuser to the children.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's a skill.
Well, I
And
was
what,
gonna
what did the children, what was their relationship with him at this point? How did they, I mean, they were very, very young, but what did they feel about him?
Well, when our marriage ended, and this is another area where I felt very naive, because no one was talking about these things, I had no idea what to expect. And my one of the biggest sources of contention in our relationship was that he had nothing to do with the kids. In fact, when he came home, my oldest daughter would run from him. She was afraid of him because this inner rage that he carried. And so when our relationship ended, I truly believed that it would stay exactly as it was. I had the kids 99% of the time. During our marriage, I considered my co-parent to be our nanny. So I would never have thought to ask him to watch the girls if I had an errand to run or if I needed to go to work. And I just believed that would carry over. I had no idea that he would want custody of the kids because I didn't understand what happens when you put up these boundaries and walk away. You know, they became his primary focus because he knew that was the number one way to hurt me the most. And he was right. So when I first received his court paperwork, and at several junctures, he was asking for full custody, for
Yeah.
me not to even have custody. It was my worst nightmare.
Tina, I can relate to this. This is completely my story as well. I had 10 years of litigation abuse from a guy who was mentally ill, you know, and diagnosed as such, and who would fire his lawyers and represent himself pro se. And I have to tell you, you know, I knew of your blog and I knew of your work, but it wasn't until I was working for the DC Bar Association, interviewing a family law lawyer for some story for Washington Magazine, when she said, blah, 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 litigation abuse, blah, blah. And I'm like, what? This is a thing? You know,
Yeah.
like, I mean, I was years out of it. And there, as you said, there was not awareness that this is a tactic of abusers. I mean, and I, you know, like you, I persevered, I got through it. But yes, it was chaos, it was crazy making. And I wanted to get back to you talking about the control and what he's doing. To me, it seems like a campaign to make you look crazy and vindictive, and he has clean hands. When they go right up to the edge of what's legal and illegal, it is terrifying. You're a mother, you care about your children, and it is crazy making. You know, you can never, you always feel off balance. You can never relax. You can never, I tell people, be the sane parent. It's very hard to be the sane parent when you're being provoked like this.
Yeah. No, I describe it as on the day I received my family court case number, it was like being assigned my own personal terrorist. And so, you know, and it was always, you know, what seemed like little things to everyone else. But I remember going out of my apartment one morning and my wedding videos were sitting on my front porch. And it was just a way to let me know he had been there. And you know, what do you do? Call the police and say he dropped off my wedding videos? They're going to say, "Oh, that's so nice of him," you know. And it was constant things like that to where I knew he was outside of my house. One day the court ordered him to return all of my photographs because he had stolen all of our children's photographs. So I came out early one morning and my entire stairwell to my apartment was lined with photos stacked from top to bottom. And
Oh,
he was
he got
sitting
in?
sitting at the bottom watching my reaction. And so, you know, I now have a diagnosis of PTSD because I was stalked and terrorized for so long. And so I understand how, you know, when we're in a court system that doesn't recognize trauma and they're not trained in the basics of domestic abuse, how survivors end up looking to be the crazy ones. Because when you're living under a constant fear, and truly, I slept with a hammer under my pillow for a couple of years because I was so afraid of this man. The fact that, you know, I was able to maintain is still, I look back and I was in such a fog. You know, I wouldn't wish it on anyone.
If it weren't for the children, you could have just gone a very, very long way away and had nothing more to do with him. But of course, he was able to use the legal system to get at you. I would imagine he used the sort of access to the children. At what point did you have to stop handing your children over to this man who had you living in terror?
6 years. It took me a full 6 years. There was a really pivotal point 2 years into it where one day I had a break from work and I decided to just go sit in the courtroom and watch proceedings. And I remember the judge looked up and he knew me very well by that
Oh
point
no.
because we were in court so often. And he said, Swithin, what are you here for? You're not on calendar. And I said, Your Honor, I'm just here to observe today. And that day really changed my life because I saw things through a different lens. I saw things through the lens of strategy to where these are just business transactions to the court. This is not personal. It's not emotional. It's not their kids. And so I really started following other cases, learning the system, um, following attorneys from courtroom to courtroom, just to learn how, because I was representing myself, I didn't have an attorney. And I became very skilled at documentation and very, having to operate through the lens of strategy versus emotion. But even at that point, it was another 3.5 years before I was successful in protecting them.
Can you say you touched on it a bit about documenting things and being strategic, but what do you advise people to do who are in high conflict divorce situations? I mean, they may not be to the extreme of someone as abusive as your ex, but it's contentious, controlling. How do they fight against the narrative that they're the unbalanced, vindictive one? Excuse me.
Right. So for me, it was the realization that the court didn't know who I was,
Mm,
and they were lumping me into the same category as him. So if I received an email from him that was designed to provoke me and upset me, my response to him played right into the narrative that this was a high conflict situation. And so I had to start being very strategic. I kept a post-it note on my computer that was my reminder. And it said, to judge CC ex-husband. And that was my reminder that everything I put in writing could potentially be read by the judge. And so it was my goal to show the judge who I was as a co-parent and not feed into what he was trying to accomplish and take my power back. And so I almost had to, when I was putting things in writing, I almost had to pretend that I had a healthy co-parent on the other line so
Oh,
that
man.
I could um, redirect the case. And then, my documentation, somebody told me early on, document everything and then document more. But it felt really frustrating for the first few years because no one was looking at it. I'm doing all of this. I have tons of it. So for me, it became getting that organized and not overwhelming the professionals because I would hand them things and they would glaze over.
Yeah.
So it became understanding what mattered to the court and being very strategic about what I put in front of them. The things, my threshold, my bar for what's acceptable when it comes to my children is very different than the courts. The
Sure.
court sees the worst of the worst and the most extreme things. And so a lot of what I was putting in front of them didn't even register on their scale as problematic. And so it was really shifting and understanding what mattered and what I would provide to them. I often tell people that my documentation was a part-time and sometimes a full-time job,
Yeah.
but to this day, only 1% of that has been seen by the courts or by anyone within the court system, um, because I became very skilled at knowing what to give them so that I could help them see what was happening.
And what was happening in terms of your children? This is a long period of time. They started off very young, and then they start to grow up during all of this. So what impact did this have on them?
He was very cruel to one of my daughters. We had, the typical dynamic, a golden child, and then a child that was very targeted by him. But he had extreme addiction issue with alcohol. And so he was either drinking, wanting his next drink, or hungover. And so, his regulation was really all over the place. And the littlest things that the kids would do, my oldest daughter was taking ornaments off a Christmas tree too fast at one point for his liking. And so he physically grabbed her arm and squeezed her arm. It ended up with her running through the house, locking herself in a bathroom. He terrorized my children that day. And I ended up taking them to the police station to get it documented because my daughter's arm was red where he had grabbed her. And so it was, things like that. His rage, he couldn't contain it behind closed doors. The other huge source of contention was his family. And I didn't want my children around his older brother. And his older brother, it's not the way I ever wanted to be validated. But in 2016, he was arrested for molesting a little girl.
Oh,
And a 5-year trial that really threatened to destroy me. He was sentenced to 280 years in prison because his crimes were so horrific. And this was a man that my ex-husband lived with. So there were, a wide scale of issues that were taking place. And, so much of it, a big issue that really rose to the attention of the court, he would constantly give me fake addresses where the girls would be. And he would choose sometimes gated communities where he knew I couldn't get in to verify the address. And I remember at one point knowing that's not where my kids were. And so constantly just being on edge, not knowing where my little girls were, if he was driving them over the Canadian border or, fleeing with them. And there was one occasion where he gave the court an address, gave me an address, gated community. I had a friend who was a realtor who took me into the community. We were able to photograph it and prove that it was an empty lot. So, proving that he was lying, it seemed to matter to the court when he was lying to them.
yeah,
But none of
that's
his
okay.
lies to
Yeah.
me. The judges took it very personal. But
Well, excellent. I mean, it sounds like you got his parental rights terminated, which is no small feat. It is a very high bar to do that. And he was that much of an asshole and that much of an abuser. So, I mean, it is a battle. I mean, hats off to you. That is incredibly mighty to, and your instincts were so on point too. I think that's really important to say, especially when you've been mired in it and around it for so long. It's so easy to muffle those sirens, and you listened to yours, especially with regards to that brother-in-law.
yes.
Well done.
Do you think anyone at the start of this journey, though, who's going, who's back where you were a few years ago, have things improved? Have we got more of a recognition of this kind of abuse, or will they have to go through years of the horror that you went through in order to get to the point where you are now?
I think sadly, I think we're in a worse position than we were when, and it pains me to say that because I know that so many people hear these stories and say, I'm not leaving, I'm staying because I can't go through that. So it's really difficult for me to verbalize that, but I think that unfortunately our court system is worse than it was back then.
I wanted to talk a bit about your work in family court and trying to educate judges and family court attorneys about abuse. Could you talk a little bit about the for-profit reunification camps? I read about them tangentially, reading about parental alienation, and before our conversation, you were saying this is actually even a thing in Europe. What are they, and how prevalent are they?
So when there are very predictable playbooks of what is happening in our present day court system. And if I were to walk into the court and claim abuse, I can almost bet money that the abuser is going to try to turn the tables, Darvo, and basically say that there is no abuse, that I am, air quote, alienating the children. And, do I agree that there are people who try to turn children against the healthy parent? Absolutely. I do not deny that. I know a lot of people who that has happened to. Would I ever use the word alienation to describe it? Absolutely not, because I do see that word and that movement as the root of the majority of issues in our present day court system. It has become there's an attorney, Richard Ducote, who says alienation is the only disease diagnosed by attorneys. And it is that sums it up. It is a very lucrative and very profitable legal strategy that is successful. And so we are in a court system that places so much emphasis on pro-contact between both parents. And they believe that if a child doesn't have a relationship with one parent, they will be irreparably harmed and to the point of no return. I don't believe that to be true. I believe a child needs one healthy parent to thrive. But an entire industry has built, I call it the reunification industry. It has built around this belief that children need both parents. And it starts with reunification therapy, forcing children into relationships, most of the time with an abuser. And that in itself is so traumatizing to these kids. But it's almost like once that process starts, the case has entered a pipeline. And where it goes from there, if the reunification efforts are not successful, and they will rarely be successful because you can't force a bond in a relationship between two people, especially when one is resistant for valid reasons. Then if the family has enough money, they could be slated for reunification camps, which is a horror and a nightmare in itself. And
Like it's literally camp, like you go away, you sleep over, you all have to be together. Like what's going on at the
It's
camp?
not an actual camp. They're usually conducted in Airbnbs or in hotel suites, sometimes in the abuser's home. There are a couple of actual facilities. There's one in Texas, there's one in California. We've heard one in Florida. But it's considered a 4-day intensive is how they sell it. Even the people running the camps admit that it's not therapeutic in nature and it's actually experimental. And their research, I have video clips of the people who run the camps saying this is experimental. So we're basically using traumatized and abused children as guinea pigs for profit. These 4-day camps range anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 for 4 days. And on day one, the children are told that whatever happened to them in the past doesn't matter, whether it was abuse or neglect, or it doesn't matter. We're here to focus on today and forward movement.
God.
And it's a whole systematic approach over these 4 days, but it doesn't end at 4 days. When the camp comes to an end, the children are then prohibited from contact with their preferred parent or their safe parent for a minimum of 90 days, but it's even worse than that. I have yet to hear of a single case where the kids have been returned to their healthy parent or their safe parent in a year. There are kids that have been missing for
How does this work? So we believe that children need both parents. That's the hypothesis for all of this. But
right.
the answer to that is to take them away from their primary caregiver.
Yeah.
How is that reunification?
Because they say, well, their explanation on it is that this preferred or safe parent is alienating them, that they are so toxic that their hatred for the other parent overrides their love for their child. And so that parent is actually the dangerous one. Um,
Wow. It's so the Darvo is just all baked in, isn't it? Wow.
Right. And the reality is these people, once you are in this pipeline, this reunification, I call them reunification profiteers, once you're in their pipeline, it can be $100,000 in the first year between the pre-care, the camp, and then the aftercare. And what the judges are doing is they believe these air quote experts, and so they give them full authority. They're basically transferring their judicial authority to these people to determine when the preferred parent can come back into the child's lives.
Do
And
you have a count of this? Like, how prevalent is this? I mean, does this happen very often? Are we talking dozens of people, hundreds of people, just a handful of
well,
people?
there was recently an investigative journalist who did a piece on this, a short documentary, and I believe her calculations were that 600 families that she was able to calculate in the United States have been sent into these programs. And that's just what we know of. I think it's actually much greater than that.
Well, I'd be curious to hear from our audience because this is totally, that's the bandwidth of what they go. But I'm just kind of horrified on many, many different levels. I mean, I know parental alienation is a thing, but I wonder, you talk about the gendered element of this because it sounds like it's mothers that this is happening to. And I wonder about a world that would rather believe that women are vindictive than believe that men are abusive. And I just want to say, because I've goes both ways. Women, of course, can be abusive and vindictive as well. But to me, I see the gendered element. I'm curious what you see in your work.
It's absolutely happening to men. Again, it's a legal strategy that has been employed by attorneys and embraced heavily, but the majority of the issues are moms being victimized by this legal concept and strategy.
Wow.
And ultimately, the kids are the ones who suffer. I recently created a platform called thechildrenarecoming.com to give them a voice, because the one thing I've maintained over the past 10 years is that we're going to see change when we start hearing from these kids who have aged out of the system and are, sharing the horrors of what they've been through. Some of the stories from the reunification camps, the people running these camps should actually be behind bars. It is that bad. We've heard about kids being stripped down to their underwear if they're not complying, to humiliate and degrade them, doors being taken off rooms,
Oh my
mattresses
God.
mattresses being removed. It's hard to believe that this is happening, but the issue is that it's been happening behind closed doors and underground almost for so long that the general public is just now learning about it. So we've developed this platform, and we're starting to hear from teenagers, from young adults who want to have a voice.
I'm
And
sorry, what's the name of the platform again? Okay.
thechildrenarecoming.com.
Okay.
And we have the full social media on all of that. I'll send you the information, but we're starting to highlight their stories and really give them a voice, because they are the ones we should be listening to, and their voices will be the change. I believe that.
It sounds like there is awareness. I mean, we did talk to the mother of Caden, the girl who was murdered
Yeah.
in Caden's Law, and it sounds like that's being picked up, or at least in the Pennsylvania, it's waiting to be heard in the Senate, but it looks like that could go through, and that there's bipartisan support for laws that have to truly investigate abuse claims when evaluating custody cases.
Yeah, and that's been a big part of my advocacy as I shift towards legislative change. Successfully passed Caden's Law in Colorado, Peaky's Law, which is a variation of that in California, Utah just passed Ohm's law, which is a variation of Caden's law. And actually in Pennsylvania yesterday, the governor signed it into law.
Oh, really?
So,
Oh,
and we have it as federal law. It was picked up with the Violence Against Women's Act. Tennessee, their legislation is currently sitting on the governor's desk waiting for signature. And so that could very well become law shortly. That will be April's law. And then in Arizona, I've been working on efforts on legislation that will just specifically target and prohibit reunification camps.
well, so Tina, you are making progress. You are changing it. I know you may think it seems worse than it did, but maybe that's just because there's awareness now than
Yes.
there wasn't before.
Yeah, there was a story here in California last year that gained international exposure. We had shared a video. It's the case is Justice for Maya and Sebastian, and it was two kids in Santa Cruz, California, who were. When you see how these kids are taken to reunification camps, it is horrifying. They send in usually very large adults, complete strangers, to physically remove them. This young girl, Maya, was 15, and she reached out to me in the days leading up to them being taken. And so community members gathered and filmed what I would call a legal abduction. And in the process, her clothes were pulled off by these people. Her face was slammed into a
Oh my
car
God.
door, as they tried to shove her in the car to take her to the reunification camp. And their case really put an international spotlight on this. I believe, just on our TikTok alone, there are almost 4 million views on the video. And so, I think that case has really put things on the map.
Oh, thank you for all your important work on this. Wow. I feel like I got an education today. Tell us where we can find you.
I am at One Mom's Battle. That is my main website, onemomsbattle.com. All of my social media handles are One Mom's Battle. And yeah, we do familycourtawareness.org. That is every November. It's an opportunity for survivors to really raise awareness within their communities, because that's an angle that is desperately needed. So we work with survivors to get proclamations and declarations in their city or county or state, to put this on a map, because we need everyone talking about family court and what's happening behind closed doors.
Wow. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolute honor to be here and to connect with both of you.
That wraps another episode of Tell Me How You're Mighty. You want to leave us a mighty story or a fuckwit of the week submission? Check out our new website, tellmehowyourmighty.com. That's yours spelt YOURE. We've got all the episodes, show notes, links to our guests, and you can see the tea room where Sarah and I first met. If you enjoyed this episode, please review the podcast and follow us. Thanks. See you next week.